wonderful to be in Cluj. This is actually my second time in Romania, but the first time in Cluj. And it's, as you have gathered now, a completely different topic. How to feed the world in 2050 when we have 10 billion people, but more importantly, when we have an increased meat demand. And I will, if you're not aware of it, I will show you that meat actually is a delicious product, a very nice product, but it is very costly in terms of resources and in terms of environment. Now, I'm a medical doctor, and I used to build blood vessels by tissue engineering, which is the medical field where you take cells and take biomaterials and make tissues of organs in order to replace them in people who have damaged tissues or dysfunctional organs. And when I came across doing the same thing for skeletal muscle cells, our muscles basically, I thought, well, this could have a much bigger application, being consumption meat. It's kind of an unusual thought, but I think it's worth investigating. So, you may not be aware, but when you eat a hamburger, a quarter pounder, there's a lot of resources that go into that. It's about 7 pounds of feed. It's about 50 gallons of water, about 75 square feet of land, and about 1,000 BTU of energy in 1 quarter pounder of hamburger. That's a lot of resources that go into that small piece of meat. It's not only that, it's also that right now we are already using 70% of all our agricultural lands to produce beef, or to produce meat, I should say. If meat demand, as the FAO predicts, in 2050 is going to be 70% more than what it is now, the math is very simple. We are not able to produce that amount of meat with the current resources that we have. And we have to come up with other solutions. In addition to that, and it now sort of gradually becomes known that livestock contributes about 15 to 20% to our greenhouse gas emission. And in particular, cows emit a very nasty gas, methane, which is a much more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. So basically, a vegetarian with a Hummer is better for the environment than a meat eater on a bicycle. I'm from the Netherlands, we drive bicycles, but we also eat meat. So these are the issues that really are concerning and disconcerting, and we need to come up with a solution. Now, we can all become vegetarians. By the way, who of you is vegetarian? Right, not too many. It's about the average of Europe, I would say, about 4%. And it varies from region to region, but it hasn't varied a lot over time. So apparently being vegetarian, although it looks very, very appetizing, is not something that we do very easily. And it's not only that, it's, you know, if we all become vegetarian in Europe, then it still wouldn't matter, because in India and China, and at some point in Africa, people are going to eat meat as soon as they can afford it. We have now 2 billion people on this planet who are involuntarily vegetarian because they just cannot afford it. And as soon as they become richer, they will buy meat, which is sad, although not for them, but it's sad for the planet and sad for our resources. So this is the human trophic level. It's where we are on the food chain. If you're a plant, it's 1. If you're an animal that eats plants, it's 2. If you're an animal that eats animals, that eats plants, such as us, it's 3. So we are at 2.35, meaning that 35% of all our proteins come from animals that eat plants. And this is exactly where India and China gradually are going towards that same level. And that's because that statistic, that human trophic level, is linearly related to the gross domestic product of a country. In other words, as soon as you become rich, you start to buy meat and you start to eat meat. So on a global level, it's even going to be less likely that we can all become vegetarians. Now, I started with tissue engineering as a possibility to build muscle. This is actually an old idea. Winston Churchill in 1932 already alluded to this. He said, at some point, we will see the absurdity of raising an entire chicken if we only eat the breast and the leg, and we will be able, under a suitable medium, to culture the tissue itself without all the consequences for animals and for environment. The technology in 1932 wasn't there yet, to be honest. So we had to wait for the discovery of stem cells, and specifically stem cells in our muscle. Every muscle tissue has its own stem cells. They are designated stem cells that are sitting there waiting to repair tissue in case of injury. And you can take them out. Stem cells have this wonderful capacity. They can still divide, they can proliferate to a tremendous extent. And they can form these tissues. They do that inside of the body, but they can also do that outside of the body if you create the right conditions. So what we basically envision is that you take a biopsy from a cow, you poke it in the butt with a needle, take a small sliver of muscle out of it, 1 centimeter long, 1 millimeter in diameter, has a couple of hundred of these stem cells, and then you let these stem cells proliferate. And they pretty much do that by themselves. They proliferate so that from that small sample of muscle, you can create 10,000 kilos of beef. So you can kind of tremendous magnification here, which is nice because then you can reduce the total herd of cows in the world from 1.5 billion heads to, let's say, 30,000. And then you would not have the methane emission issues, and you would not have the resource issues. Because especially those cows are a very, very inefficient technology. They are actually an obsolete technology. We should just abandon it and replace it with something else. So that's fine, then you have these cells, but cells, if you don't eat them, they don't taste, they don't have protein, and you have to make a tissue out of this. Now, these cells are pretty smart. If we create the right conditions, they start to make a tissue. They start to make, first of all, you have to understand a skeletal muscle cell is actually a merger of a larger number of cells, and so they start to merge. And that's easy to be done. We starve them, and then they merge. And they form this primitive myotube, which is a very primitive muscle cell, doesn't have a lot of protein still yet, doesn't work. And we all know muscle needs to work before it gets sufficient protein and before it gets sufficiently bulky. Now, fortunately, believe it or not, these cells are programmed to work. They are exercise junkies. Our brains are not exercise junkies, that's why we don't exercise, but our muscle actually is. And so, if we create the right conditions, which is basically a temporary gel where you put the cells in so that they can find each other and attach to each other, and then provide anchor points so that they can develop tension, because the muscle needs tension to get that protein synthesis going. And we basically do that by culturing it in a circular fashion around our central column. And then we just sit back and wait for 3 weeks, and then the muscle starts to contract, they start to build up tension, they start to build up the protein, and within 3 weeks, when you harvest it, it looks under the microscope exactly as a muscle fiber taken from a cow or from a supermarket steak. So what we basically did, we made 10,000 of these fibers by hand, very boring and tedious work. And we build it into a hamburger. And here you see the one real hamburger and one of our cultured hamburgers. And we took the very unusual step, as was already mentioned, unusual for a scientist, to present that in a hybrid between a cooking show and a press conference in 2013 in London, for 2 reasons. One, we wanted to just kill the discussion, you know, this cannot be done, and say, well, here it is, we can do it. And second, by the way, we need to do it, because we are facing a problem in the near future with meat production. So this is a small video where we presented that hamburger. It was cooked by a very courageous chef. This hamburger was €250,000 in value. He didn't burn it. that was good. Actually, he had an exercise hamburger the day before, which is now sitting in a museum. It was tasted by 2 independent food critics and journalists who said it was okay. It was meat, and they also thought, well, the fat is missing. It's not a perfect product, which we knew, but they recognized this as meat. The texture was fine, and the taste was sort of was meat, but not really high quality, not what you would expect for €250,000. Okay, so that's nice. Then you have a proof of concept. That was actually our goal. You know, this can be done. The technology is there. How do you go about to make it into a product. And of course, it needs to be an efficient production system because we want to replace that cow that is very inefficient. So it needs to be efficient. It also needs to be sustainable in a very limited sense in that all the material that goes in there is of seemingly unlimited supply in nature. And third, it has to mimic meat because we don't need animal proteins. That might be somewhat of a surprise. You guys don't need animal proteins. We just don't. That's a myth. And there are a couple of vegetarians here in this audience who are still alive and prove that every day that that's true. And there are actually 2 billion vegetarians on this planet who prove that every day. So we don't need them. You have to be a little bit more picky with what you eat, but you don't need animal proteins. That's not the reason why we are doing this. We are doing this because we want meat. That's the product that we like. And it's very difficult to get rid of that sort of addiction or craving or whatever you want to call it. Okay, so the product has to mimic meat. It has to be meat. And in essence, it can be. Okay, so how do you go about with efficiency? You have the cell culture under control. Obviously, you need to scale it up in one go, and it can only be efficient if you scale it up. So we envision that we, at some point, culture this in a 25,000-liter bioreactor, which is basically the quarter size of an Olympic swimming pool, and you can provide meat for 40,000 people in a bioreactor. 25,000 liters sounds like a lot of water, but that's not in comparison to what your actual hamburger costs right now. It's nothing. It's basically 10% of that. So here's just an example where we grow these cells on little spheres that are floating in that suspension in that tank. So it can scale up and it can be made efficient because efficiency is in this field, it's kind of odd, but in this field is number of cells that you can grow per milliliter of fluid. And right now we are at 5 million, 40 million has been described, and if we can achieve that, then you will just remember that number. I will come back to that. Okay, so that can be done. And then a very early life cycle analysis has estimated that this would reduce the amount of land and water by 90%, the amount of energy that you need by about 60%, depending on where in the world you do this. So that's nice. Then it has to be sustainable. This is a very busy slide, and it's intentionally busy because we have on the x-axis a whole lot of culture conditions, and on the y-axis growth of cells, number of cells. And you see all the high bars is where we added serum to the cells. And that's traditional in cell culture. You add serum, which is a blood-derived product, which, guess what, comes from cows. So if we want to reduce the number of cows, we cannot use that blood. And we have worked long. You see here a couple of conditions where actually no serum has been added and serum replacers. That technology is also there. It just needs to be optimized for this particular cell. Okay, you can further, these muscles contract, as you see. It's live tissue, obviously, and they do that pretty much by themselves. And if you let them contract, they start to develop more protein, and they start more and more to look like meat. The other thing that we were a little bit concerned about was that those muscle fibers that went into that hamburger were yellow and not red. That's because of a protein called myoglobin in our cells. That's basically a hemoglobin type of protein that's red in the presence of oxygen and blue in the absence of oxygen. And these cells don't really express that much myoglobin because we culture them under ambient oxygen conditions, which actually for our body is too high for our tissues. So if you reduce that oxygen condition, again, a sort of change in the culture conditions, they actually increase that myoglobin expression and they become nicely pink. And by the way, that's also the source of our heme iron, which we like in meat. So then you have to create fat tissue. Muscle is, or meat is not only muscle but also fat, and we got the criticism that this doesn't contain fat. There are not a lot of applications in the medical field to produce fat, as you can imagine. So we had to redesign that system. And right now, this is a fat tissue. All that's red is fat here. And so we can basically dial in the number of fat that we want. And by the way, we can also use these fat cells to make omega-3 fatty acids so that the whole product becomes a little bit healthier for you with the same amount of fat. So that's the things that you can play with. Now, when we launched this, the popular press said, yuck. this is not the way we should go. This is just, you know, it's sort of an emotional reaction. And as a scientist, I couldn't really deal with that because I didn't know what was behind it. So I started to, pretty much as an amateur on my own, started to think, well, what's happening here? Why do people don't like this? And so we have in the Netherlands, you probably don't know this, but we have a sausage called the frikandel, and it's very popular, and nobody knows what it is. And if I ask Dutch audiences, and I ask, do you want to know what it is? They say, no, really not. We don't really know what it is. So, but they still eat it. So we are perfectly capable of eating stuff that we don't know what it is or how it's being produced. Why is that? And why is a hamburger from a lab suddenly yuck? My interpretation, and I'm happy to listen to comments, my interpretation is that that frikandel, my neighbor eats it, and he stays alive, and at least short term. And so it's apparently safe. That takes time to develop a trust in that product, and of course regulation as well. The second is control over how our food is being produced. We would like to have the illusion of control over how our food is being produced. And what you inevitably do, if you learn about a technology like this in your mind, you translate that to multinationals, large factories, in low-wage countries or wherever, and that also doesn't really bring about the amount of trust that you need. And that's confusing the technology with how it's being implemented in society. Because this technology, so we developed kind of a narrative, the organic variant of cultured beef, if you like, where Pookie is one animal in a small farm in the middle of a city, say Cluj, and he has only 3 pigs and 3 cows and 3 chicken. They get attended by the primary school kids, they give them names, they pet them, they feed them. Once in a while you poke them in the butt to get their stem cells, and in a shed adjacent to the farm you grow the amount of meat for a community, which is a local-to-local sort of production system. So that's the organic variant of meat, but really what it does is illustrate that there's the technology on one side and how it's going to be implemented on the other hand, and that you shouldn't confuse that. The final part is a little bit more difficult. And that's the culture, I'm going the wrong way, the culture that is associated with meat. Maybe there is something in meat, you know, it's dominance over another species, it's killing another species. Maybe that's even important for our sense of what meat is. It's the romance of cowboy movies, of campfires, all that sort of thing. And a lab, admittedly, is not a very romantic space, right? So we have to work on that. But other than that, I cannot really deal with that immediately. That it was not so bad with the acceptance was shown by a survey in the Netherlands, a cross-sectional survey in the population where we asked the people, would you buy this if it was available? Now, admittedly, this is the Netherlands, so it's sort of a selected group of people, but 52% said yes, probably or for sure. So that was kind of encouraging. So we moved on in fantasizing of what you can do once this is accepted. You can make all sorts of other mixtures of stem cells and mixtures of creatures. And as I mentioned, you can also make the product actually healthier for you. So those opportunities are there. Now, the price obviously was prohibitive, so we worked on that. We calculated that together with one of the companies, the largest suppliers of stem cells for medical purposes. They have a model. You put your numbers in the model, and they come up with a price of what eventually it's going to be if you scale up, because obviously that's dependent on scaling up. And to our surprise, this is the model. You go from very few cells to very large number of cells to actually, at some point, a 25,000 liter bioreactor. And then to our surprise, they came up with a price of $65 per kilo, which is still very high. It's still 30% more than what we have right now. But if we go from that 5 million cells to 40 million cells, this comes down a factor 8. And then all of a sudden it becomes a reality. So I haven't talked about animal welfare, but I think this is going to happen, and I think for consumers in the supermarket, when they get, let's say, 5 or 7 years from now, are going to faced with that choice of a livestock hamburger or a cultured hamburger, probably the animal welfare criterion is going to play a major role in your choice. At least that's what I hope. I thank you very much for your attention. I'm happy to entertain questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Professor Post. So I have the first question. We'll open to the audience in a second. So you, at your closing, you hinted at like 5 to 7 years. So it seems my 2020 goal is not that realistic. So what do you think on like timelines? When we will be like first time really have a commercial product, and will this enter like the upscale market because you said like the price, or what is kind of like the first market introduction that you can see for this?
Yeah, I'm not a marketeer, obviously. I'm just a medical professor. But the scaling of the product and the price point of the initial product is such that it's likely to be a sort of high-end market, restaurants, entrepreneur, or specialty stores, that sort of thing. That might also be a benefit because that makes it a desirable product.
So Michelin-star cultured beef restaurant.
Right. But obviously my goal is really to avert the consequences of livestock, and then it needs to be large scale, cheap, and readily available.
Okay, that's fantastic. So if you have a question, then raise your hand. We can take 2 or 3 questions from the audience, if there's any. There's one over there, if you can have a microphone there. Just a second, the microphone is coming to you in a second. There.
Excuse me, what about milk and cheese?
Milk and cheese, excellent question. So there are a couple of byproducts, well, maybe not byproducts, but also major products of cows that you need to do as well. So we now have a meat company and a leather company, because leather will also disappear if we get our way. We are not working on milk. Other people are working on milk. There are 2 ways. One, you take the milk proteins and have them be produced by bacteria. There are now 2 companies on the West Coast who are doing that. The other way is sort of our way, tissue engineering, which, by the way, we aren't doing, is tissue engineering milk glands and let them produce milk and then milk them. That's possible. It's probably easier to coerce bacteria into making the milk proteins. And cheese, obviously, is a derivative of milk. Yeah.
Okay, one more question over there.
Hi.
What about this, and then we're...
What about soya versus meat? I mean, it is true that soya contains a double quantity of the essential of amino acids than the meat contains. And what about the spirulina, which contains 3 times or 4 times more essential amino acids than the meat?
Right. So there are a couple of vegetable alternatives and also insect alternatives that could satisfy our need for proteins. But it cannot at the moment satisfy our need for meat. And that's exactly my point. If you want to eat soybeans, great. You know, I'm not going to stop you. It's wonderful. But a lot of people want to have meat, and I haven't seen a soy or lupine or whey or whatever type of non-animal protein you have to texturize that into a meat-like substance that actually fools most people. They're just not good enough yet. And they have been working on it for 35 years, so apparently it's very difficult to do.
You were saying that we're not necessarily meat eaters, but most of the evolutionary scientists are saying that evolution of human beings went through a process of eating meat most of the time, including today.
Let me just quickly repeat that for the audience, since
Right.
I think not everybody can hear you.
How can I do that?
If we can get you the microphone that was just here a second ago.
So most of the evolutionary scientists are saying that meat and evolution of human beings was very, very closely related. We grew our brains, for instance, by eating meat. That was one of the explanations for that. And most of the human evolution happened to be powered by meat. It's protein, it's energy in a very condensed form. So you were saying that we actually don't need that, whereas biology teaches us that it's part of our, and should be part of our daily plan.
Right, and I don't think that's what biology is telling us. That's what anthropological biology is telling us.
Yeah.
But that's because the people, the Homo sapiens, started to evolve before we actually had decent agriculture. Agriculture is only 13,000 years old. So we could only build our societies and nourish our people to a sufficient level once we had agriculture. And before that was just not possible. So you cannot, in biology, it's very, very difficult to have a causal relationship between one item and the other item. So yes, it coincided with each other, definitely.
Agriculture was also farming and livestock, not just plants.
Right, but it started with plants. Livestock farming followed.
Because we already hunted.
Sorry?
We already hunted when we started to grow plants.
That was not farming. That was not farming.
No, but it was part of our diet.
Right, and necessary because we couldn't farm.
So you're saying we should give up on eating meat?
Yes.
Because we don't need it?
Yes. Okay.
But we evolved around it.
So
we're made of it.
Well, the second point I want to make
are all meat,
is the second point I want to make.
We're not plant.
The second point I want to make, the thing about evolution is that we change and that we adapt.
Yeah.
That's the sole definition of evolution. Okay. So what we needed maybe a million years ago may not be the same as what we need right now.
No, excuse me, I have one final question here, then we're done. So he was first here.
Yes, just one short question, please. Do you believe that this product could ever be accepted by vegetarians?
I'm afraid it will, yes. I don't know where the question came from. I'm afraid it will, and I say I'm afraid because I see it as a unwanted side effect of this technology that vegetarians start to eat this. Because what vegetarians do is already better for the planet and better for our resources than eating at some point cultured beef. I can never be as efficient as a plant. So I prefer vegetarians not to eat this and stay vegetarian. But it's not my choice.
Thank you.
Okay, guys, we have one final question from Rohan. I know that you're all very excited. We can interview him outside a little bit later. So we have one final question here, and then unfortunately we need to wrap up.
So first, thanks very much for this. As a vegetarian who is converted to eating meat and kind of wishes I was vegetarian, I'm really inspired by this. But I was curious, I remember, and I don't recall the details, a few years ago there was another scientist who I think 3D printed meat using some kind of a flour or something like that. I was wondering if you could comment on that and if I'm recalling correctly at all.
Right. No, there is 3D printing is just providing form, right? A 3D form. And so this technology allows us to make very small strips of muscle. So if you combine it to a patty, you have a hamburger. It wouldn't allow us to make a full steak. So for a steak, we need to impose a 3D form upon our muscle fibers from the beginning. 3D printing is one technology that would do that. I'm not sure it's the most efficient one. We are looking at other technologies, but that's definitely what at some point we need.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Post. It seems to be very controversial.
Yeah, good.
So I think that is great.
Thank you.
So I hope, because there's a lot of questions, I hope you can maybe be a little bit available, outside, to answer a few more questions. Yeah. Because there seems to be a lot of people who want to get hold of you and shake you and say, give us our meat back.
Right.
So I think there's a lot of discussion still to be had on that subject. So thank you very much for finding all the way to Cluj.